The first thing my daughter-in-law said at my husband's funeral was, "Margaret probably won't keep the house much longer." I heard it before the pastor even finished greeting the guests. People think grief makes you deaf to everything else in the room. It doesn't. If anything, it sharpens the silence between words. I stood beside the polished oak casket, my black gloves folded neatly in my hands, watching the slow stream of people step forward to say polite things about Robert Whitmore. 42 years of marriage reduced to soft voices, quick handshakes, and casserole promises. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish. Robert would have noticed that. He always noticed small details. That was part of the reason he built everything so carefully, piece by piece, like a man stacking stones along a shoreline so the tide wouldn't take them away. I looked around the room at the people who had come to honor him. Most of them were neighbors, old friends from the church, a few colleagues from the engineering firm where Robert had worked for nearly 30 years. My son Daniel stood near the front, stiff in his dark suit, nodding politely at condolences he probably wasn't really hearing. Beside him was Claire, my daughter-in-law, wearing a sleek black dress that looked far too fashionable for a funeral service. Claire always dressed like she was attending an event instead of a moment. When our eyes met, she gave me a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, then leaned toward Daniel and whispered something. Daniel shifted awkwardly and glanced in my direction before looking away again. I pretended not to notice. It was easier that way. The service began with a quiet hymn Robert used to hum on Sunday mornings while reading the newspaper. The organ notes echoed through the chapel, slow and steady, like footsteps on a long hallway. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the sound of Robert's voice in the kitchen, the way he would measure coffee grounds with careful precision, the way he always insisted on paying the electric bill 2 weeks early because, as he used to say, peace of mind is worth more than interest. Robert believed in quiet preparation. He believed in patience. And he believed that the smartest move a person could make was keeping their cards close to the chest. When the hymn ended, people began moving toward the reception room next door where coffee and small sandwiches waited on long folding tables. I walked slowly behind them, keeping my hands folded and my posture straight. Grief makes people expect you to collapse. I didn't collapse. I simply moved carefully, the way you move when the ground feels unfamiliar. As I stepped into the reception room, I heard Claire's voice again, clear enough to carry across the quiet conversation of the guests. "I mean, honestly," she said softly but not softly enough, "Margaret is going to have to be realistic. Robert handled all the finances. She probably doesn't even know where to start." A few people murmured something sympathetic. Someone glanced toward me with that careful expression people use when they think you're fragile. I lifted a small paper cup of coffee from the table and took a slow sip. It was too bitter, but I didn't react. Claire continued speaking, her voice filled with the kind of concern that sounded generous on the surface but carried a thin edge underneath. "Daniel and I will help her figure things out," she said. "It might be time to sell the house. Downsizing would be practical." I watched her as she spoke, the way a person watches clouds drift across a quiet lake. Calm, detached, almost curious. The funny thing about assumptions is how comfortable people become when they believe them. Claire believed I was a widow who had just lost everything. She believed I didn't understand money. She believed I would eventually need her guidance. I didn't correct her. I didn't interrupt. I didn't say a single word about the truth Robert had carefully arranged long before this day arrived. After all, there was no reason to mention the $28 million quietly waiting in my name. I stayed at the reception for exactly 43 minutes. I remember because the large clock above the church kitchen door ticked loudly enough to count each passing second. People kept approaching me with soft voices and careful smiles, placing gentle hands on my shoulder as if I might shatter if they touched me too firmly. They told me Robert had been a good man. They told me he had lived a full life. They told me that if I ever needed anything I only had to call. I thanked each of them politely. Grief, I have learned, comes with a strange kind of theater. Everyone knows the lines they are expected to say. Everyone performs their role. Claire performed hers very well. She stood near the center of the room like a hostess guiding a small gathering, accepting sympathy on Daniel's behalf, while quietly shaping the story people believed about my future. I noticed how often she used the word practical. Practical about the house. Practical about finances. Practical about the next steps for someone in my position. That phrase lingered in the air like the scent of the lilies beside the guest book. Someone asked her what she meant. Claire lowered her voice slightly, but not enough to keep it from carrying across the table where I stood. She said Robert had always handled the complicated things. She said I had never been involved with the numbers. She said it would probably be easier for everyone if Daniel stepped in and helped organize what was left. What was left? It was an interesting choice of words. I stirred the coffee in my cup, even though there was nothing in it that needed stirring. The spoon moved slowly against the paper edge with a quiet scratching sound. For a moment, I wondered if Robert would have laughed at the situation or simply raised one eyebrow the way he used to when something predictable unfolded exactly as he expected. Robert had always believed that people reveal their intentions most clearly when they think you are powerless. That idea returned to me while Claire continued speaking with gentle authority. She mentioned assisted living in the same careful tone someone might use when recommending a vacation destination. She explained that some places offered lovely walking paths and organized dinners and transportation services. She said it would relieve me from the stress of maintaining a large house alone. Daniel nodded beside her as though each suggestion sounded reasonable. I watched my son carefully. Daniel had always been quiet when he was uncomfortable. When he was a boy, he used to look at the floor during arguments, tracing invisible lines with the toe of his shoe until the tension passed. Now he did something similar with his coffee cup, rotating it slowly in his hands while Claire spoke for both of them. I wondered if he noticed how quickly she had taken control of the conversation surrounding my life. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he simply believed she was helping. Claire finally turned toward me with the warm expression she used when addressing strangers. She asked if I was holding up all right. She said the coming weeks would probably feel overwhelming. She said Daniel, and she would help me review Robert's account soon so we could understand exactly where things stood. I met her gaze and gave a small, calm smile. Then I told her that was very thoughtful of her. Because sometimes the easiest way to learn what people truly want is to let them believe they are already getting it. I left the church shortly after that conversation, stepping out into the cool afternoon air that carried the faint smell of rain. The parking lot was half empty by then. Most people had already said their final goodbyes and returned to their ordinary routines. Grief moves slowly for the person who lost someone, but the rest of the world continues at its usual pace. I unlocked my car and sat behind the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The silence inside the car felt different from the quiet inside the church. This silence belonged to me. Robert had driven this car more often than I had. I could still picture the way he adjusted the mirrors before every trip, even if he had driven the same road 100 times. He liked order. He liked preparation. And most of all, he liked plans that unfolded exactly when they were meant to. The house was unusually still when I arrived home. The front hallway looked exactly as we had left it that morning. Robert's umbrella still rested in the brass stand beside the door, even though it had not rained in days. I hung my coat carefully and walked into the kitchen. The clock above the stove read 4:17 in the afternoon. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to sit down at the small wooden table where Robert and I had shared thousands of quiet dinners over the years. I rested my hands on the table and looked out the window toward the maple tree in the backyard. Robert had planted it when Daniel was 6 years old. He once told Daniel that trees were the most patient investment a person could make. They grow slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize they have become something strong enough to outlast you. That memory stayed with me as I stood again and walked down the hallway toward Robert's study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Robert believed every working desk should be simple and organized, so the surface held only a reading lamp, a leather notebook, and a small wooden box I had seen many times but never opened. Robert had always handled the family finances quietly. It was not secrecy exactly. It was more like a habit formed through decades of careful planning. He believed money worked best when it moved quietly in the background while people lived their lives. I sat in his chair and opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside were neatly arranged folders labeled in Robert's steady handwriting. Property taxes, insurance documents, investment summaries, everything in perfect order. Near the back of the drawer sat a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in blue ink. Margaret. The sight of that handwriting made my chest tighten for a moment. I picked up the envelope and ran my fingers along the edge before opening it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small business card. The card belonged to a law firm in downtown Chicago. Beneath the firm name was a handwritten note from Robert. He had written only one sentence. Call him when the time feels right. I looked at the phone number for a long moment before placing the card gently on the desk. Outside the study window, the late afternoon sun stretched across the yard, casting long shadows across the grass. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started, the steady hum carrying through the quiet neighborhood. I thought about the conversation at the church. I thought about Claire discussing my future as if it were already decided. And I thought about Robert, who had spent his entire life believing that preparation was the most powerful form of protection. Finally, I reached for my phone and dialed the number written on the card. I held the phone to my ear while the call connected, listening to the faint clicking sound of the line transferring through the city exchange. Outside the study window, the sky had turned a pale evening blue, the kind of quiet color that appears just before sunset settles over the neighborhood. After 3 rings, a calm male voice answered and introduced himself as Michael Halpern. His tone carried the careful steadiness of someone accustomed to serious conversations. I told him my name slowly, making sure each word was clear. For a brief moment, there was silence on the other end of the line, and then his voice softened with recognition. He said he had been expecting to hear from me eventually. Robert, he explained, had been very specific about that. I sat back in Robert's chair and listened as Michael spoke. He did not rush his words. Lawyers who manage important matters rarely do. He said Robert had come to his office several months earlier with a collection of documents and a very clear intention. Robert wanted to make sure everything was organized in a way that would protect me after he was gone. Those were the exact words Michael used. Protect Margaret. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the desk as he continued explaining that Robert had created a private trust long before his illness became serious. The trust contained several investment accounts, 2 commercial properties, and a series of long-term bonds Robert had purchased gradually over the years. Each piece had been arranged carefully, like sections of a structure designed to hold steady even if the rest of the world shifted around it. Michael asked if I would be able to visit his office the following morning so he could walk me through the full details in person. I told him yes. After we ended the call, I remained in the chair for a while, letting the quiet settle back into the room. The study felt different now. Not empty, exactly. More like a place that had just revealed a hidden door I had never noticed before. I stood and walked to the window, looking out across the backyard where the maple tree moved gently in the evening breeze. Robert had always believed patience was the most powerful advantage a person could have. He never rushed decisions. He never explained more than he needed to. And he never allowed other people to see the full picture until the moment was right. I thought again about Claire standing in the reception room earlier that afternoon, discussing my future with polite confidence. I could still hear her voice describing assisted living communities and practical decisions about selling the house. She had spoken as though the story of my life had already reached its final chapter. Perhaps that was the most interesting part of the entire situation. Claire believed she understood the ending. She believed the widow sitting quietly with a cup of coffee had nothing left but memories and a house that was too large to maintain. I turned away from the window and closed the drawer of Robert's desk, placing the envelope carefully back inside. The next morning I would meet the lawyer and learn exactly what Robert had arranged. But even before hearing the numbers, I already understood something important. Sometimes the greatest advantage a person can have is letting everyone else believe the wrong story for a little while longer. I woke early the next morning, long before the neighborhood had fully come to life. The house carried that quiet stillness that exists just before sunrise, when even the clock seemed to tick more softly. For years Robert had started his mornings at 6 sharp, brewing coffee while the sky slowly brightened behind the maple tree in the backyard. That habit had become so familiar that my body still followed the same rhythm. I moved through the kitchen almost automatically, filling the kettle and placing it on the stove. The sound of water beginning to heat filled the room with a low, steady hum. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the small wooden table where Robert and I had shared countless mornings discussing ordinary things. Weather forecasts, grocery lists, Daniel's plans for the week. Those conversations had always seemed simple at the time, but now they felt like small pieces of a life that had been quietly well organized. At 8:30, I left the house and drove toward downtown Chicago. Morning traffic had already begun to build along the highway, long lines of cars moving steadily beneath the pale light of the early sun. I watched the city skyline grow larger through the windshield, tall buildings rising above the river like rows of polished glass. Robert had loved this city. He used to say Chicago was a place where careful people could build strong futures if they paid attention to the details. Michael Halpern's office was located on the 20th floor of a narrow building near LaSalle Street. The elevator ride was smooth and quiet, carrying me upward past rows of office numbers. That flashed briefly above the door. When I stepped into the reception area, the space smelled faintly of fresh paper and polished wood. A young receptionist greeted me with a professional smile and asked me to take a seat. A few minutes later, Michael appeared from behind a glass door. He was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and calm eyes that seemed used to observing people carefully. He shook my hand and guided me into his office where a large window overlooked the busy streets below. We sat across from each other at a wide conference table while he opened a leather folder filled with neatly arranged documents. Michael spoke slowly, explaining each part of the arrangement Robert had created. Years earlier, Robert had established a private trust that would remain separate from the standard probate process. Over time, he added different assets to that trust, always quietly and always with careful planning. Michael slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. It listed the total value of the accounts and properties combined. I studied the number for several seconds before reading it again to make sure I had not misunderstood. $28,417,000. The figure rested on the page with a kind of quiet certainty that felt almost unreal. Michael watched my expression with polite patience and then explained that the trust listed only one primary beneficiary, Margaret Whitmore. My name appeared clearly in the center of the document. I looked down at the page again and felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over me. Robert had not simply prepared for the future. He had anticipated exactly how things might unfold once he was gone. Michael continued explaining the structure of the trust, but my thoughts drifted briefly back to the conversation in the church reception room. Claire discussing practical decisions. Claire explaining that I would need help understanding Robert's finances. Claire speaking with the confidence of someone who believed the situation was already under her control. I folded my hands gently on the table and listened as Michael finished outlining the final details. By the time the meeting ended, I understood one thing very clearly. Robert had spent years building something that no one else in the family even suspected existed. I left Michael Halpern's office just before noon and stepped back onto the busy Chicago sidewalk where the city moved with its usual determined rhythm. Taxis rolled past in steady lines. People crossed the street with coffee cups in their hands, and somewhere down the block a construction crew hammered steel into place. The world looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside my understanding of it. I walked slowly toward the parking garage, the leather folder Michael had given me tucked neatly beneath my arm. Inside that folder were copies of the documents Robert had prepared so carefully over the years. Investment statements, trust agreements, property titles. Every page reflected the same patient strategy Robert had always believed in. Quiet preparation. I sat in the driver's seat of my car for a moment before starting the engine and allowed myself to breathe in the stillness of the enclosed space. $28,417,000. The number no longer felt abstract the way it had when I first saw it printed on the page. Now it felt real, solid, like the foundation of a house that had been standing quietly beneath my feet the entire time without anyone noticing. As I drove back toward the highway, I thought about Robert sitting at his desk late at night over the past decade, reviewing documents, making calls, adjusting plans with the same calm patience he used for everything else in life. He had never been a man who talked loudly about money. In fact, Robert often said that wealth worked best when it remained invisible to people who did not need to know about it. Perhaps that was why he never corrected Claire's assumptions during family dinners when she spoke confidently about investments she barely understood. Perhaps that was why he allowed Daniel to believe the house and a few retirement accounts were the extent of what he had built. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers of the city as I guided the car through the slow traffic leaving downtown. I remembered Claire's voice at the reception again, describing assisted living facilities as though she were offering helpful advice. I remembered the way Daniel avoided looking directly at me when she suggested selling the house. At the time, their words had sounded almost rehearsed, as if they had already discussed the subject privately before the funeral even took place. That thought stayed with me as the city gradually faded behind rows of suburban neighborhoods and quiet streets lined with oak trees. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon light had softened into the warm color of early evening. The house looked exactly as it always had, calm and orderly, the maple tree casting a wide shadow across the lawn. I carried the folder inside and placed it carefully on Robert's desk in the study. For a few minutes I stood there looking at the documents again. Then I closed the folder and slid it into the same drawer where Robert had kept his envelope. Some truths do not need to be announced immediately. I understood that much now. Robert had spent years building something strong enough to protect me. The least I could do was use the same patience he always trusted. Because if Claire and Daniel believed I was fragile and financially helpless, there was no reason to correct that belief yet. Sometimes the most useful information is the kind people reveal when they think you have nothing left. I spent the next 2 days moving through the house with the same quiet routine Robert and I had followed for decades. Mornings began with coffee at the kitchen table while the sun rose slowly over the maple tree in the backyard. Afternoons passed with small chores that had once been shared responsibilities. I watered the plants in the sunroom. I folded laundry. I organized the pantry shelves the way Robert liked them, labels facing forward in careful rows. From the outside, my life probably looked exactly as Claire imagined it. A quiet widow adjusting to an empty house. Someone who might soon need guidance. Someone who would eventually rely on her son and daughter-in-law to manage the practical details of the future. That assumption worked in my favor. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel called and asked if he and Claire could stop by that evening. His voice carried the same hesitant tone I had heard during the reception at the church. Daniel had never been comfortable discussing serious matters directly. He preferred to approach difficult conversations slowly, often allowing Claire to lead them. I told him they were welcome to come for dinner. I prepared a simple meal the way Robert and I always had when Daniel visited. Roast chicken with rosemary, steamed green beans, and mashed potatoes. The smell of the food filled the kitchen while the evening light filtered softly through the windows. At 6:30 their car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the window as Claire stepped out first, smoothing the front of her coat before walking toward the door. Daniel followed a few steps behind her, carrying a small box of bakery cookies as if he were visiting a neighbor rather than his own mother. When they sat down at the dining table, Claire complimented the meal with the careful enthusiasm people use when they want to appear thoughtful. For the first 15 minutes, the conversation stayed comfortably neutral. Daniel spoke about a project at work. Claire mentioned a charity event her friend was organizing next month. Then, slowly, the topic shifted exactly where I expected it to go. Claire folded her napkin beside her plate and leaned forward slightly, her expression calm and practical. She said she had been thinking about my situation since the funeral. She explained that the coming months might feel overwhelming with paperwork and financial decisions. She suggested it would be wise for Daniel to help review Robert's accounts so we could understand what resources remained available. Daniel nodded quietly beside her. I listened carefully, keeping my hands folded in my lap, while Claire continued outlining a series of reasonable-sounding suggestions. She mentioned downsizing again. She spoke about the cost of maintaining a large property for one person. At one point, she even mentioned a retirement community outside the city that she said offered excellent amenities and organized activities. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone presenting a thoughtful plan. I allowed a small pause before answering. Then I told her I appreciated their concern. I said the future was still a little unclear to me. That answer seemed to encourage her. Claire relaxed slightly in her chair, as though the first step of her strategy had gone exactly as expected. What she did not realize was that every word she spoke revealed more than she intended. And sometimes the most valuable information comes from listening quietly while someone explains exactly how they believe your story will end. I washed the dishes after Daniel and Claire left, letting the warm water run slowly over the plates while the house returned to its familiar quiet. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the stove, marking the passing minutes of an ordinary evening. Outside, the streetlights had begun to glow along the sidewalks, casting soft circles of light across the neighborhood lawns. I dried the last plate and placed it carefully back in the cabinet before turning off the kitchen light. The house felt peaceful again, the way it always had when Robert and I finished dinner together and settled into the quiet rhythm of the evening. Yet the conversation at the table replayed itself clearly in my mind. Claire had spoken with the calm assurance of someone already planning the next stage of my life. Daniel had followed her lead, nodding politely, avoiding the direct weight of the discussion. Their assumptions had been easy to hear beneath the surface of their words. They believed time would slowly push me toward dependence. They believed that confusion and paperwork would eventually force me to rely on them. Most of all, they believed that whatever Robert had left behind would be small enough for them to manage. The following morning I returned to the study and opened the drawer of Robert's desk again. The leather folder rested exactly where I had placed it. I lifted it carefully and spread the documents across the desk beneath the soft glow of the reading lamp. The numbers looked just as steady as they had the day before. Investment accounts, property holdings, bonds that had been quietly accumulating value for years. Robert had built everything with the patience of a man who understood the long view of time. As I reviewed the pages again, a small detail in the trust agreement caught my attention. Near the final section of the document, Michael Halpern had included instructions regarding the official family meeting for the estate. According to the legal process, the attorney would present the financial summary to immediate family members during a formal review of Robert's affairs. The meeting had already been scheduled for the following Monday afternoon. Daniel would be there, Claire would be there, and Michael would present the details of the trust exactly as Robert had arranged them. I closed the folder slowly and leaned back in the chair. For a moment, I imagined Claire's expression during that dinner conversation, the way she confidently described practical decisions about selling the house and managing what she believed were limited resources. I wondered what she expected to hear when the estate meeting took place. Perhaps she imagined a modest retirement account and a few predictable assets that would require careful budgeting. Perhaps she believed she would leave that meeting with a clearer understanding of how to guide my financial future. The thought made me smile slightly, though the room remained completely quiet. Sometimes the most powerful moment in any story arrives not when a plan begins, but when the truth finally enters the room. And in just a few days, the truth Robert had prepared so carefully would speak for itself. Monday afternoon arrived with the quiet certainty of a clock reaching the hour it had been counting toward all week. I drove back into the city shortly after noon, the leather folder resting beside me on the passenger seat as the highway carried a steady stream of cars toward downtown Chicago. The sky was clear and bright, sunlight reflecting off the tall buildings that framed the river. I parked in the same garage near LaSalle Street and walked the familiar block to Michael Halpern's office. When I stepped into the reception area, Daniel and Claire were already seated on the small leather sofa near the window. Claire stood immediately when she saw me and offered a careful smile that carried the same polite concern she had practiced during dinner a few nights earlier. Daniel hugged me gently, his hand lingering on my shoulder for a moment before we all followed the receptionist into the conference room. Michael greeted us calmly and invited everyone to sit at the long polished table. A folder sat in front of each chair. The atmosphere felt professional and quiet, the kind of setting where every word carries a little more weight than usual. Michael began by explaining the purpose of the meeting, outlining the standard legal process of reviewing the estate and ensuring that Robert's final arrangements were carried out exactly as intended. Claire listened attentively with her hands folded on the table, occasionally glancing toward Daniel as if confirming they both understood what was being said. When Michael opened the first document, he described the house, the basic savings accounts, and several modest assets that Claire seemed to expect. She nodded calmly through those details. Then Michael turned to the final section of the folder and paused briefly before continuing. He explained that Robert had established a private trust several years earlier that operated separately from the public probate process. Claire's expression shifted slightly at that sentence, though she remained composed. Michael placed a printed summary in front of each of us and spoke with the same steady voice he had used throughout the meeting. He said the trust contained multiple investment accounts, long-term bonds, and commercial properties accumulated gradually over the past decade. Then he stated the total value of those holdings clearly and without hesitation. $28,417,000. For a moment the room was completely silent. I watched Claire read the number on the page in front of her. Her confident posture seemed to pause in place, as if the air itself had shifted. Daniel leaned forward slowly, studying the document with a mixture of surprise and quiet disbelief. Michael continued speaking, explaining that Robert had named a single primary beneficiary for the entire trust, Margaret Whitmore. My name rested plainly in the center of the document. I folded my hands calmly on the table while the realization settled across the room. Claire looked up from the page toward Michael and asked a few careful questions about the structure of the trust, but her voice no longer carried the certainty it had during dinner. Daniel remained quiet beside her, reading the summary again as if confirming that the numbers had not changed. When Michael finished outlining the final legal details, he closed the folder and thanked us for attending the meeting. I stood from the table and gathered my coat with the same calm pace I had used all week. As we walked toward the elevator, Claire remained unusually silent, and Daniel looked thoughtful in a way I had not seen before. Robert had once told me that patience reveals more truth than confrontation ever could. Standing there in the quiet hallway, I realized he had been right about that too.